What's up guys, this is VinylicPuma, back with another Borderlands video, and today I figured we could talk about whether a Borderlands 1 remaster slash remake slash re-release will ever happen. Now before we start, this is going to be a speculation video, so it's entirely possible my prediction is totally wrong. However, I think you'll find that after watching, you may end up agreeing with my assessment. As always though, whether you agree or disagree, feel free to let me know what you think is going to happen in the comments section below. And with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started by talking about why Borderlands 1 should be remastered, remade, or just re-released. Borderlands 1 is considered by some within the community to be the best game in the series, as it easily has the best loot system. Not to mention that its mechanics are very much like Borderlands 2's in the pre-sequels, making it a perfect candidate to modernize. When it comes to a re-release, it would be nice to play the original game at 60 FPS for better motion and input lag, and at a higher resolution to overall boost the visual fidelity. A lot of 360 and PS3 era games that have been re-released have greatly benefited from the enhancements to resolution and frame rate, which makes them a lot more enjoyable to play. As for a remaster or even a remake of Borderlands 1, it's worth mentioning that certain aspects of the game, if given better presentation, would be a lot more enjoyable. As a great example, unlike Borderlands 2, which has a story that's easy to follow, Borderlands 1's story's pacing suffers somewhat due in large part to the lack of voice acting to help narrate how the story progresses. Plus, some other aspects of Borderlands 1 haven't aged especially well either, like how the directional indicator on the HUD that tells you where to go is a lot more abstract and potentially frustrating to use than what appears in either Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel. Not to mention that other features like being able to move while in Fight for Your Life and some bug fixing would do the game a lot of favors as well. After all, it's pretty frustrating to go down and then have a guy run behind cover in Borderlands 1, and it's also frustrating to find that certain weapons don't display their rarity right, which makes them far more difficult to recognize when you actually encounter them. Overall, while Borderlands 1 is a pretty great game as is, if it had a few improvements and overhauls here and there, it could become a much better and more fun game to play. Hence why many would like to see Borderlands 1 get a proper remaster or remake. However, it's about time we talk about what is preventing a potential Borderlands 1 re-release slash remaster slash remake from happening. To start, one of the reasons I suspect we haven't seen a Borderlands 1 remaster is due to the sales of Borderlands the pre-sequel back in 2014. While the sales of the original Borderlands and Borderlands 2 are pretty strong, with Borderlands 1 reaching about 5.76 million units and Borderlands 2 reaching 6.95 million units, the sales of the pre-sequel were lacking in comparison and only clock in at about 1.4 million units total. At those numbers, it's pretty easy to understand how this contributed to the demise of 2K Australia, as this is significantly less than what the sales of the previous games are. It's also pretty easy to understand why 2K and Gearbox are skittish on allocating the resources into remaking and/or remastering Borderlands 1. Now, if you want my opinion, I've always suspected that the pre-sequel didn't sell especially well due to how it was released on the 360 and PS3 in 2014, where the Xbox One and PS4 were already out for a year. In fact, Dark Souls 2 suffered a similar fate that year, as the sales for that game are noticeably lower than the original Dark Souls and haven't even caught up to the sales of its successor, Dark Souls 3. Not to mention that other games that came out that year that had 8th and 7th generation versions like Far Cry 4, Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, or Destiny 1 had the 8th gen versions outselling their 7th gen counterparts. Regardless, the lower sales of Borderlands the pre-sequel likely made Gearbox and 2K take a step back and cancel any plans that they would have had for a Borderlands 1 remaster. After all, if you're selling a fraction of the units that your previous two games sold, that's a cause for concern. Not to mention that the sales of the Handsome Collection were kind of bad as well, which is something else we should probably talk about. Clocking in at about 1.78 million units across all platforms based on VG Chart's sales data, the Handsome Collection sales were also lousy, even if the sales weren't quite as bad as the pre-sequels. Now, depending on how you look at it, the Handsome Collection is basically a remaster/re-release of Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel, and given its fairly low sales, this is yet another reason Gearbox and 2K have been skittish to remaster or remake the original game. On some level, I think the failure of the Handsome Collection partially lies in the fact that it didn't include a remaster of the original Borderlands. That and all the Handsome Collection really had to offer was Borderlands 2, the pre-sequel, and all of their DLC at 60 FPS, which I suspect really only appealed to the most hardcore part of the fanbase on console. Not to mention that if you were on 360 or PS3, you owned Borderlands 2 and its DLC already, and you had just bought the pre-sequel on Xbox 360 or PS3 for $60, and the season pass for an additional $30 just 6 months prior, why would you buy the Handsome Collection for another $60? Especially if you haven't upgraded to the next generation yet. So in essence, I think what happened here was that you had a bunch of people that already played Borderlands 2 that didn't want to play it again, and then you had another group of people that just bought the pre-sequel and weren't going to spend an additional $60 to re-buy the game that they just bought. And of course, the lack of a Borderlands 1 remaster, which could have been the main selling point, wasn't there either, and thus it just underperformed. Whatever it was, and as far as a Borderlands 1 remaster is concerned, I think it's fair to say that a remastered Borderlands 1 became less likely at the time based on how the Handsome Collection sold. However, if the sales were much higher for the Handsome Collection, we may have likely gotten a Borderlands 1 remaster by now. Now up to this point, we've pretty much talked about games that released like 3 to 4 years ago. So let's talk about some challenges that a Borderlands 1 re-release or remaster currently faces in 2018 and 2019. As far as a standard 1080p 60 FPS re-release is concerned, I foresee some difficulty with that happening due to streaming services like PlayStation Now, Xbox One backwards compatibility, as well as the affordability of PCs to run the original PC version. The fact is, if you must play Borderlands 1 on console, Xbox One users can currently go to a used game store and pick up a copy of the 360 version and stick it in their Xbox One. If you own a PS4, you can opt to pay Sony a certain amount of money per month to stream games through PlayStation Now, which is less ideal. However, that is a way to play Borderlands 1. In fact, I could see the PlayStation Now option becoming more viable in the future, as it's worth mentioning that Sony has recently said that they plan on allowing people to start downloading games through PlayStation Now, much like Microsoft does with Game Pass. If that happens, rather than just re-releasing the game, you could just pay Sony a certain amount per month and get access to Borderlands 1 along with a bunch of other games for a low price. While it's still true that you're still playing the 360 and PS3 versions, it would potentially negate the need for a re-release in either case. Not to mention that if you have a fairly modern laptop and you want the better frame rate, Borderlands 1 on PC does have Xbox 360 controller support, and I suspect it can run fairly well on those systems due to the game's age and fairly low system requirements for the time of its initial release. I do have to admit that it sucks that you're not going to be able to get access to a physical version with DLC on the disc. However, I do think that the advent of some of these streaming services, as well as Xbox One X enhancements, could prevent the need for a pure 1080p 60 FPS re-release of Borderlands 1. That said, a significant remaster or remake of Borderlands 1 is a different story, and I think depends on Borderlands 3's success. While we don't have a concrete release date yet, it's safe to say that another Borderlands is probably coming out in the next 2 years. After all, this console cycle is coming to a close. Pitchford has been on record saying 90% of Gearbox is working on the game we want them to be working on, and both Gearbox and 2K's parent company, Take-Two, has been on record saying there is a highly anticipated sequel from 2K set to release sometime in fiscal year 2020. With this in mind, it seems that given the lack of success with Borderlands the pre-sequel and the Handsome Collection, that Borderlands 3's success will determine whether we get a Borderlands 1 remaster or not. Not to mention that if Borderlands 3 comes out and is a huge success, it makes more sense to release a Borderlands 1 remaster after Borderlands 3 for all of the newcomers to the franchise. Honestly, I think this would be a better outcome, as Borderlands 3 will likely have far better graphics and detail than Borderlands 2. Plus, seeing Borderlands 1 running in Unreal Engine 4 with massive graphical improvements, better textures, and maybe even HDR would certainly be a treat. It might even be as much of a visual improvement, with a visual difference comparable to something like the difference between Modern Warfare Remastered and Call of Duty 4. In my estimation, Borderlands 3 at this point seems like it's going to be the biggest predictor as to whether we will get a Borderlands 1 remaster or not. So I suppose to answer the question posed in this video's title, it all depends on Borderlands 3. If you ask me, I think the least likely thing to happen at this point would be a generic 1080p 60fps re-release of Borderlands 1 on PS4 and Xbox One. After all, given the fact that the Xbox One X is capable of greatly enhancing the visual fidelity of a lot of 360 games, and the fact that PlayStation Now will likely allow you to download titles, thus making it far more accessible, I doubt that we'll actually see a generic 60fps re-release. If a Borderlands 1 remake or remaster were to happen, it would have to be a total visual update / overhaul of the original game. On the low end, my guess is it would be a lot like the remasters of Halo 1 and Halo 2 via Halo 1 Anniversary and the Master Chief Collection, which in that case would just be a graphical / visual mod that's basically the same game that was released all those years ago. On the high end, Gearbox could go all out, and we would get a total remake that replaces a bunch of the original assets, like we're seeing with the total remake of Resident Evil 2. Personally, my hope is that we do see Borderlands 1 get remade or remastered at some point, because otherwise, whatever a standard re-release might offer could probably just be accomplished through Xbox backwards compatibility or PlayStation Now for console users. At minimum, I think a remaster / remake on the level of something like Halo 1 or a Halo 2 Anniversary should be what they do. That way, it's at least of huge benefit to PS4, PC, and Xbox One users alike. Or hey, given Borderlands 3's late release in the PS4, Xbox One console cycle, maybe a Borderlands 1 remake will end up on PlayStation 5 or Xbox next. I guess we'll see what happens, but until then guys, I think that's going to pretty much wrap up this particular video. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload more videos, and as always, thank you all so much for supporting the channel, take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.